one issue, I don't know if you've been able to get your microphones to work, but one issue that was fascinating for me was the relationship between certain geometric propositions, that is the form of the city, and the parallel underlying systems, which I feel like the forces of globalization, what the geometry of that is, the geopolitical movements of people across the planet, what might the form of that be, the landscape, like the ecological systems, what are their patterns? And so we're constantly playing between these kinds of idealized forms like the circle, the square, the triangle, and so on, and the more contemporary revisions of formal possibilities which are around the rhizome, which I think Rod was talking about, these sort of networked transactive systems and the colloidal systems that are obvious in Dali's envisioning of architecture. There's probably a good discussion to have around what is the formal parallel, not the form of the city, but if you like, the geometric underlay that constitutes the way in which the city is constructed and thought about, the political system, in the way in which that's constructed and thought about, and I suppose the philosophical, conceptual systems that we use to talk about these things. What's the geometry of that? So I wanted to maybe ask each of the speakers to talk about that idea of geometry, how we've gone from a sort of idealized geometry to a very different kind of geometry, whether it's in the aesthetic, the formal, the political, the theoretical.
As you have seen in my presentation, the stellar or the circular shape was pretty constant in the initial ideas of utopia. And then when the next generation of utopias, if you want, started to flourish, especially when European utopian thinkers moved to the New World to create their own utopia, the circular shape changed completely. New Heaven is organized around a very rigid grid that has nothing to do with the previous ideas. The stellar shape of Palmanova or Sforzinda were actually related with the goal to protect the city, to defend, and that's why, I mean, there was those walls that created corners and several corners around Palmanova and Sforzinda. So they were actually related to the function of protecting the places. As for now, I mean, I was really intrigued by the idea of a small or little utopia that you mentioned. I don't know how those places can be actually designed in terms of shape, if that idea of little or small utopias should have some specific form or shape, and if that shape would be related to some specific form, or more importantly, actually strongly related to the site, and so react to the site as it was not in the past, where actually those forms were very rigid and did not talk with the site.
So Rod, with your work, I'm assuming that the idea is that the form of the city is not imposed, but is enabled to develop in whatever form it takes, and that in a sense that's not predictable.
Look, I might refer to Simon's talk really, because I think that there's a parallel, I suppose, which is the idea of this tension, a dialogue, a dialectic between formal, fixed, and the more informal and open-ended, which is essentially the argument that's being put by Sassons and so forth in the Keto Papers, which is really, it's not to say that you don't need the top-down formal systems, but that it needs to be accompanied by recognition of the importance of the bottom-up. And I guess there's a parallel, if you like, with then the geometry that might go with that. I think there's this desire for the city to be finished. Still we're entranced by the idea of a master plan. It gives confidence, it has political agency to be able to talk about a plan that is going to be completed in a certain time period, which is obviously in tension with the idea of things continuing and never being finished, which is the counter-argument that is being promoted not simply by the Keto Papers, but as you've seen, I think, even in the papers commissioned by the Property Council of Australia, which is essentially the voice of the property industry. So I'm assuming they did a final edit on what, Greg Clark said. So I think that it means that we can then start to talk more about this, a dialectic on the one hand, that we need both. We need the big infrastructure systems, we need electricity grids, to put it in those terms as well, but we don't want those simply in the face actually of a planetary crisis to then rely entirely on these formal systems, because we know that they're incredibly brittle, or they're politically brittle. So I think we've got this interesting, whether it's geometry, whether it's the visual realisation of it, and some sort of, some sort of representation of that visually, literally visually, or whether it's through organisational structures which are both formal and informal, and the idea of networked and systems. So I think there is really a sort of a paradoxical thing where we're saying, well, utopia is not a closed vision. Actually, if we think about a utopia which is going to take us forward in a good way, if we're then more concerned with the process rather than the form, with the meta rather than the morph, then I think we've got a different conception of what utopia could be. So I think it holds us back to continually think of utopia having a singular form, but more particularly even a singular vision that we're working towards, because it's really about multiple visions being contested and being allowed to exist, actually, I think was my main point, that we actually need now to, on one hand, resist. And when I say resist, I almost mean it in the electrical sense, that things heat up. When you actually slow things down, you want the friction, you want the tension. The modernist project or the functionalist project has been very much about the elimination of tension, the elimination of negotiation, and it's why in the Keto Papers is actually that step beyond public space to the commons, because the commons is different to public space. It's the difference between simply happening to be in the same public space at the same time as someone else who you don't know, a stranger, to actually being in a space which is common but continually negotiated. And that's when we get into then the social cohesion, and then we know that the social benefits that come from that, because we know that it's actually the stickiness of social relationships that's important, that we see people in different situations in local community, we see them in different capacities, in the shop as the vendor, but also in the sports team, at the school or whatever. It's the stickiness of those social relations, which is actually, we know, it's not utopian in a sense, it's purely empirical. We know this stuff. So that's building on it's actually building on empiricism to actually formulate a utopian vision, but I suppose I'm questioning the whole terminology of utopia because of all the baggage that goes with it, because it absolutely has with it this heavy baggage of history from, as we've seen with Danilo's presentation, this heavy baggage of it being singular, closed, final, set.
So this stickiness, just to finish, maybe this stickiness, how do you take that in terms of that colloidal, soft, limp, melting, liquefied, viscous kind of tectonics that Dali is so fond of?
I think the hard and the rigid and the inflexible will always be more articulate than the soft and the porous and the viscous. And the hard constructions decay because they are never sufficient. So it's like a Taoist metaphor. Water defeats rock slowly. But if you take a photograph, the rock seems more impressive and more dominant. But it's an illusion of perspective to imagine that the hard and the rigid is more dominant. But if you read a book, you look at a text, that's definitely what comes forward. And over time, the water evaporates and disappears, and we're left with the dry ruins of things. And a lot of the time if you think about what the first half of the 20th century or the modernist period, profoundly misunderstood a lot of the forces of softness and porosity. But that was their duty at that time, was to establish greater order. And it's easy for, like I said, for soft, porous, boundaried people to criticize hard structures because they don't do certain things, which they don't and they never will. And the opposite critique also functions. So we all build up these hard, rigid structures because that's what we need to do, and we watch them break and fall apart, and we mourn their loss, and then we build some more again.